to show a few slides, a few images, and then mostly talk to you. And I'm going to be backing and forthing, which I'm not super great at, but we'll see. So I'm going to start with a completely shameless plug um, and tell you about my podcast as soon as the slide wants to change. Here we go. For the past sort of year and a half, I've been doing a very, very deep dive into Homer's Odyssey uh, in conjunction with a podcast that I started, and that's called the Odyssey. And if you are super tech savvy and you want to just take a picture of that QR code that's on the screen, that actually works to my astonishment and will take you to the iTunes. Or you can go to my website, which is www.tomleestoryteller.net. And that's my very discursive, I call it sort of rabbit holey pursuing of the story of the Odyssey, but chasing every sort of random story that crosses this path. I always say that myths really never begin and they never end. The ending of every myth is the beginning of another myth, and the beginning of one myth is the end of another myth. So that's the philosophy behind the podcast. Tonight I have about 45 minutes, so I'm going to try to be a little bit more contained. And just to say, I'm not a woman, never have been a woman, have no plans ever to be a woman. So I'm delighted to weigh in on this topic. But I'm also very sensitive to the fact that in the past 20 years, um, people who are underrepresented in literature are making their voices heard, and publishers and museums and schools are doing a great deal to advocate for that. So I love the balance of testosterone and estrogen when I get together with other storytellers, especially female storytellers, and we talk about the same stories. I listen certainly as much as I tell, because my perspective is very much from the white male privileged educational background, and I'm very aware of that. So I was pleased to be able to tuck into the idea of women in the Odyssey, of which there are many. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. Um, Odysseus, we think of the Odyssey as this sort of testosterone laden story of this man against all odds coming from the Trojan War, this incredibly masculine, violent poem. And then the next story that we have being the Odyssey, and it has this kind of masculine tenor to it. But if you just stop and look through the feminine lens at the poem of the Odyssey, women are everywhere. Women punctuate the poem from the beginning to the end, literally from the very beginning. The first person to speak in the poem is Athena. And Athena asks her father, Zeus, what about Odysseus? He's been languishing for 7 years. The Trojan War has been over for 7 years. When, Daddy, are you going to let Odysseus go home? And the gods have sort of been vaguely aware of Odysseus's problem. The gods are always only vaguely aware of human problems unless they affect the gods themselves. And this is what sets the whole plot in motion. And throughout the poem, he encounters mortal women, immortal women, goddesses, witches, dead women, ghosts. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's a fascinating lens to look at the Odyssey through. So just to go back to that image we were looking at before, this is a piece of cloth, and it's actually from Egypt. The climate in Egypt being much hotter and much drier, a piece of cloth like this is going to survive much longer than a cloth from Egypt. There's only very tiny little scraps in a few Egyptian museums. But I just love this piece. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it literally takes my breath away when I stop to look at it. This is linen woven from flax, but it's sort of a royal quality. This is the finest quality. This is very young flax plants that were used to make this incredibly fine thread. I mean, the weave on this thing is just awe-inspiring, that this was made by human hands. And it sits in a case. It was taken from a tomb. It was in a box. And here's the kicker. This is 3,500 years old. I mean, our linen closet is never that tidy, but it looks like it could have been taken out of our linen closet at home. And it's made by human hands 3,500 years ago. And this is something that I'm constantly trying to do, to breach the time between me now and the story of the Odyssey, this gap of time. In the case of the poem, it's 2,500 years, not quite as old as this amazing cloth. And here's a pot, a terracotta pot, a lekythos. This is about 6 inches high. This is also in the Metropolitan Museum. And what we see here is women weaving. I don't know if the cloth from Egypt was woven by women or men, more probably by men, but women weaving is one of the central ideas of femininity in the time of the Odyssey. Women had extremely limited social availability. They were most often kept inside, except for religious festivals, or on the exception of going to get water from the well. That was sort of a big social event for women. But women were extremely socially, emotionally, intellectually restricted. And one of their places of power was in the home and at the loom. When we think about this, and this is something I try to get young people to think about, we go to Target, we go to wherever we may go to buy any kind of article of clothing that we want. In ancient Greece, of course, everything that you wore, every piece of cloth on your bed, in your home, everywhere, was made in the home, was made by women in the home on a loom very much like this loom. Architects actually reconstructed ancient looms from this pot by the Amasis painter. This is also in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we see all women on this pot, and they're going through all different aspects of cloth and weaving, dyeing the cloth, spinning the cloth, and folding the finished cloth. And weaving, of course, is extremely important. Almost every woman that we see in the Odyssey, the first time we see her, she's weaving. Some critics talk about that this was a way that men could control women, keeping them in the house, keeping them visible, keeping an eye on them, monitoring that they were in fact working throughout the day, because they proceeded to make more cloth in the course of the day. And here we are. This is 550 BC. I said this is only about 6 inches high. This little, it would have been to have a smaller portable container of olive oil, a lekythos. Another image from the Met that is completely bound up for me with all of storytelling, but certainly of the Odyssey, is this little alabaster figure. He's only about 6 inches high. And I always visit this first when I go to the Metropolitan Museum. He's right inside to the left of the door. He's one of the oldest things in the museum. And this is a seated harp player. And this is almost 5,000 years old, 4,500 years old. And he's playing a harp. Very likely, a lot of people think that the harp looks like it's a snake swallowing its tail. It's not supposed to be that. It just looks like that. And very, very probably telling a story along with his harp playing. We have no idea. From 2,800, nobody in the world was writing their stories down. Any story that was told in 2,800 BC was only oral. It was told, it was remembered, it was retold, it was remembered. Nothing from that period, that ancient time, prehistory, nothing is written down. No stories are written down. But we can jump forward to about 500 BC, So this is only 2,500 years ago. And we see almost the same scene. This is an absolutely stunning amphora by the Berlin painter. And the man here, this is a rhapsode, and he is performing. He is performing with a harp and very probably singing a hymn or singing a poetic, doing reverence to the gods. I love the way his neck is thrown back, his head is looking up to the sky, his feet are in motion. You can even detect from the cloth that's hanging from the kitara that he's playing that he's moving around. He is dancing. But this is a storyteller. Absolutely exquisite detail here. And then one day it hit me like getting kicked by a mule that the distance between the storyteller on the left and the storyteller on the right was almost the same as the distance in time between the storyteller on the right and me. So this notion of this story being passed along, by the time the Berlin painter painted, the Odyssey was well known in ancient Greece. Here's a little bit of what some of the Odyssey looks like today. Papyrus scrolls, many of which have almost completely rotted away, have been reassembled. This was all done in Egypt 2,500 years ago. But these fragments were put together, and the final version of the Odyssey that we know today began to exist in print. And prior to that, it's anybody's guess. It's how much of the story was written down, how much was memorized, how much was made up by different poets performing the story. This is a huge field of research that you could spend your life pursuing. But I like to stress that for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, the poem was only known by memory and was only heard orally. You didn't go to the bookstore in ancient Greece and buy a book and sit down and read the Odyssey. No one did that. It was a group experience in private homes. Very often you'd hire a rhapsode to come in and you'd tell which parts of the Odyssey you wanted to hear. You wouldn't hear the whole sort of 24-hour story, but you'd hear greatest hits or a part that connected to political events of the day or personal events, maybe a wedding or funeral. Different things the rhapsode would come and perform as requested, and then be given a good meal, which storytellers to this day never object to that. So we're going to have a couple of little Greek words. I want to talk about nostoi, and I'm going to stop sharing. So the Odyssey is one of 5 books that tell the whole story of the Trojan War. 3 of them are lost to us forever. By the way, I didn't give my my little disclaimer. My standard joke is that I have a PhD, but I am homeschooled. So I am definitively not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert. When I hang around museum folks, that's where experts are experts. That's where the people know exactly what they're talking about, and their word becomes fact and law in the world of art. That's not me. I read a lot. I tell a lot of stories. I listen to a lot of young people. I get a lot of ideas. And so I'm a little nervous about anything that I state as fact because I want to run and check the fact. But anyway, 3 of the major texts that tell the whole story of the Trojan War are lost. They're gone forever. Those papyrus fragments did not get preserved, did not get collated, did not get protected by the librarians in Alexandria, burned in fires, eaten by mice, gone forever, unless some miraculous find is someday made. The 2 complete stories that we have are the story of the Trojan War, the Iliad, and then the Odyssey, Odysseus's return. There was a book that told all the stories that talked about how and why the Trojan War began. That was called the Little Iliad. And then there was a book called The Returns, because once the war ended, all of the Danaans, all of the Greek soldiers had to get home again. And some of them had very easy journeys home. Some of them had complicated journeys home. No one's journey home was more complicated than Odysseus's. So when we're hearing this story, we are hearing a nostoi. We're hearing a return story. If things had been different in time and space, we would have a lot more of these nostoi surviving to this day. So I'm looking at the women in sort of in pairs. And the first pair of women that I want to talk about is Clytemnestra and Penelope. If you're taking notes, I'll leave that for a second. Clytemnestra and Penelope. And Clytemnestra isn't even in the Odyssey, but she's an extremely important woman in regard to the story. She's extremely important in all of Greek mythology. And her shadow is cast across the story of the Odyssey. Clytemnestra was the wife of Agamemnon, and Agamemnon's sacrifice of his own daughter to the gods was essential to his ability to depart for the Trojan War. The winds would not blow. And we find out that Agamemnon had killed a deer sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And the only way she was going to allow the winds to blow would be if in return he sacrificed his daughter at the temple of Artemis. And there are many, many versions of this story. There's versions in plays, there's versions in poems. And in some, he does kill his daughter, he sacrifices her. In others, Artemis comes in at the last minute and saves her and takes her to be a priestess on an island. But the important fact is that Agamemnon's wife does not know that his daughter Iphigenia has been saved. She believes that the last thing Agamemnon did before departing for the Trojan War was to kill their daughter. And he goes off to the Trojan War. He fights for 10 years. The story of the Iliad is largely about Agamemnon. But at home, Clytemnestra takes a lover. She takes a lover, Aegisthus, and they plot. She's plotting for revenge for the murder of her daughter. He's plotting to take over Agamemnon's kingdom. And again, there's many slices and dices of how this story comes down to us. But essentially, Agamemnon comes home with his slave Cassandra, who he's stolen from Ilium. He's stolen from Troy. And he says, honey, I'm home. And she says, darling, we've waited for you for so long. Don't even step on the ground. Don't even step on the earth until you are bathed. And she spreads out a cloth that she has woven and dyed this majestic purple color. She's not rolling out the red carpet. She's rolling out the purple carpet, which is even better. And Agamemnon walks into his palace and she kills him. In some versions of the story, she has a double-headed axe and she just chops his head off as soon as he walks in the door. Others, she waits until he's in the bath, but she murders her husband. So Clytemnestra is completely unfaithful, and the only reason she's waiting for Agamemnon to return is so that she can kill him. That's the anti-Penelope. That's exactly the opposite of Odysseus's wife. Agamemnon gets right home. He has no counter winds or any problems at all. He gets right home to get killed. Odysseus spends 10 years, and the only thing he wants to do is see his house, to see his wife, to see his son, to see the smoke rising from the fire of his home. That's all he wants. And he says, as soon as I see my wife, I'll be prepared to die, but I must get home again. And he's constantly wondering, has Penelope been faithful to him, or has she been like Clytemnestra? And he finds out about Clytemnestra. He shouldn't know about her, but he finds out about her when he goes down to Hades. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reader certainly knows about Clytemnestra, or the person hearing the poem knows about Clytemnestra. So the idea that Penelope is going to be this perfect wife, waiting faithfully for her husband, weaving at her loom. She's a good housekeeper, a good matron, and she's weaving at her loom every day, waiting and waiting for Odysseus to return. And this isn't easy because Odysseus was a king. Odysseus lived in a palace. Odysseus was loaded. There's one scene where we go down into Odysseus's storage closet, and it's piled with bars of gold and piled with bars of silver. He's an extremely wealthy man. He has a son who's not quite old enough to take over yet, and he has a wife with a lot of money and a lot of land. And many, many eligible suitors come from Ithaca, the island where they live, and from adjacent islands, and they besiege the house. They take over the house. There are 20 or 30 men living, essentially. They're coming and eating every day. They come and eat, they gamble, they have the rhapsode in residence come and tell them stories, and Penelope has to put up with this. And they're all waiting for her to decide who she's going to marry. Penelope is an unmarried, wealthy woman. No, no, no. We cannot have that in ancient Greece. Penelope has to marry somebody. If Odysseus is dead, she either has to go back to her father and live with him, or she has to marry one of these eligible, rich, young, handsome suitors. And the question is, who's it going to be? And of course, the famous story that we find out early on is that she's told the suitors she just wants to weave a shroud for her father, so that after he's dead, she can bury him, wrapping him in this shroud. The burial would have been a burial in flames, but she would have wrapped his body in a shroud with oil, burned the body, and then buried the ashes. And she just wants to finish this cloth. And the suitors go along with this, but she takes, of course, a tremendous amount of time to weave this final shroud. And we find out the servant girls, and that's, I hope, the last time I'm going to call them that, because they were slave women. Many translators refer to the servant girls in the house. Thank goodness for Emily Wilson, who came along and called a spade and called a slave a slave. These were enslaved women, and they rat on Penelope. They tell the suitors that she's every night after she finishes weaving during the day, she goes to her chamber and she unweaves, and that's why she's not making any progress. So it's this wonderful image of time suspended, the weaving, the loom. This is Penelope's in control here. It's a magnificent idea. She's being the good housewife, but she's buying time in this very literal and sort of metaphorical way. Great, great image that we find out about early on in the story. Let's see. The next pair that I wanted to talk to you about, okay, is Calypso and Circe. And Circe, of course, is the star of our show tonight. True confession, I haven't read the book Circe. I am so enmeshed in the text of the Odyssey. I have been for about a year. I'm very, very timidly learning some ancient Greek and looking at it through that lens. And there's many other brilliant commentaries and editions, stories about the Odyssey. And I haven't read any of them yet because I'm really trying to keep the poem, Homer's poem, exclusively the voice of that in my mind. So I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm looking forward to hearing about the book group reading Circe. But what I love is, again, we have this pair of goddesses. And there's so much repetition in the Odyssey. It's a shame if people hear a repeated passage and they sort of think, oh, I read this already, and they kind of want to flip ahead. One of the joys of telling a story and looking at your audience is when you get a repeated passage. And I've learned over the years that when I get to something that is repeated, I don't rush it. I actually slow it down. If I'm going to say something I already said, I say it again and I slow it down. And the audience invariably falls into this sort of like, ah, I think when you're reading something repetitive, you're like, oh, okay, okay. But when you're hearing it and there's no text and you're just hearing the words you heard 10 or 20 minutes ago, oh, that's kind of nice. So Calypso and Circe both live in caves, they both live on islands, and they both have Odysseus as their lover at different points in the story. And we see exactly the same thing happen with these two goddesses. Uh, we approach their cave. It's Hermes, the messenger god, who comes to both of them. And Hermes is my new favorite god. Ever since I really dove into the Odyssey, I have a lot to say about Hermes another time. But Calypso lives in this blissful cave, this blissful island. The cave door is surrounded by vegetation. There's a beautiful reference to violets and celery that are growing at the mouth of her cave. And in my basement at this hour, I have trays of violets and celery that I will be planting in a little Calypso garden here in Bloomfield. So I'm looking forward to that. But she lives, and the first thing we see Calypso doing, guess what? She's weaving. She's weaving and she's singing. And Odysseus is living with her against his will. His ship has totally been destroyed. One of the great things about the Odyssey is it's completely non uh, chronological. It's completely mixed up. The beginning, the end, middle, the end. You never quite know where you are. And Odysseus, in the middle of the story, Odysseus starts from the beginning and then catches up to himself. But Odysseus, after his ship has been completely wrecked, all his men are dead. He's clinging to a mast, he's clinging to a board, and he washes up onto Calypso's island. And she takes him in as her lover. And there's no doubt about what they're doing in that cave every night for 7 years. Odysseus tells us, nah, didn't really want to, but had to go along with my hostess. So he's been sleeping in her bed, weeping. He goes to the edge of her island every day and he weeps for Penelope and that sight of the smoke. He certainly hopes that Penelope has not spent 7 years in somebody else's bed, but he has spent 7 years in Calypso's bed. There's not a measuring tape long enough to measure the difference of well, anyway. So he finally escapes. Hermes comes down. This is what Athena does. Athena, at the beginning, she says to her father, liberate him from Calypso. So Odysseus escapes from Calypso. He's given a ship. She gives him an axe. I love, she doesn't just give him a boat. She gives him an axe and says, now you have what you need to escape from this island. And he builds a boat. And then the boat crashes because Poseidon is furious with him, and it lands on the island of Queen Arete. And that's where he tells the whole story. And that's where we find out that a few years before Calypso, he met Circe. Before all of his men were dead, they came to an island called where the Laestrygonians live. He's had a terrible, terrible time. All right. By the time he gets to Circe, he and his men are completely traumatized. The first place they stop is at the island of Polyphemus. Polyphemus is the Cyclops, and Polyphemus is a cannibal. Emily Wilson points out that he's a vegetarian who eats cheese and lives alone in his cave until these men invade him, and he responds by eating them. But I don't think they're the first humans that he's eaten. But Polyphemus very nearly kills all of them. Wily Odysseus helps the men escape, and they get away from Polyphemus. Then they arrive at the Laestrygonians, another island full of cannibals who throw huge rocks at their ships and kill many of the men. And they escape there as fast as they can, the few remaining men that are still with Odysseus. And they come to Circe's island, and they have no idea where the hell they are. there's a great line where Odysseus says to his men, "We don't know where the sun rises and we don't know where the sun sets. These are sailors and they're looking at the horizon and they are, capital L, lost. They have no idea where they are. And they see this cave and they hear this singing. What's the first thing they think? This is going to be a cannibal. She's going to destroy us." So half of the men stay behind and half of the men go. Odysseus does not go with the first sally of men that go to see who this person is. She looks beautiful. She's singing. They even say, she's weaving. How bad can she be? She's sitting in her cave. She's weaving and singing. And she welcomes them in, and they disappear. They never come back. And one soldier who doesn't go in, who hangs back, he runs back to Odysseus, and he tells them, he says, "I don't know what's happening, but they went into that house and they never came out again." Well, we know very well, because Homer tells us what's happening. Circe welcomes all of the men in, and all around her cave are wild animals. There are lions, there are wolves, there are goats, there are sheep, and all of these animals come up to the sailors. And the sailors are terrified. I mean, a wolf approaches one sailor and then licks his hand and stares up at him. And they can't understand these tame beasts. But Circe passes wine around to all of the men and they drink the wine. This is going to be great. And then she takes out her wand and she strikes them and she turns them all into swine. She turns them all into pork as she transforms them and puts them into her pen in the back of her cave. She has this lovely pen where all these men are kept. And Odysseus comes to find out. He's had this terrified sailor. He doesn't know what's happening. Odysseus comes to find out, and he meets Hermes on the way. Hermes as a young man. And Hermes tells him, Hermes disguised as a young man. The gods are always messing with Odysseus, taking on different forms. And Odysseus is a young, sort of pre-adolescent man. And he tells him, Circe has your men. She's transformed them into swine, and I'm going to give you this plant. And if you have this plant about you, then you cannot be turned into swine. Her magic will not work on you. And Odysseus takes the herb, mole, not like the Mexican mole, but that's what it's called. And he just puts it about, he doesn't eat it, but he puts it on his person. And Hermes also tells Odysseus, as soon as you go in, she's going to try to turn you into a swine. She's going to turn you into a pig. She won't be able to. So the next thing you have to do is sleep with her. The next thing you have to do is appease her and kind of take dominance over her by sleeping with her. But you have to make her promise that when you're naked, she's not going to disman you. And this is exactly what happens. So Odysseus goes into Circe's cave. She welcomes him, presents him with wine. He sits down and drinks it very gratefully. And she whips out her wand, strikes him, and says, "Turn to a pig, turn yourself to a swine." And he doesn't transform. And she's terrified. She can't understand why her magic isn't working. She throws herself at his feet, and he says, "I'm not going to hurt you, but you have to sleep with me," which she's willing to do. Odysseus is quite a well-preserved 50-something-year-old man. And he makes her promise before he takes his clothes off. He makes her promise that there's not going to be any funny business in the bed, that she won't take advantage of his nakedness. And she does. Then she wants to give him a meal. After they make love, she wants to give him a meal. And he says, "What sort of a captain would I be if I let my men stay as pigs and I sat down to eat with you? You must change my men back before we eat together." And she does. And Homer tells us that they're even younger looking and handsomer looking and more athletic looking than they were when Circe first got their hands on him. Interestingly, that the wolves and the lions and all the other animals, they don't get changed back. Odysseus is really only concerned with his home team. We never find out who those other poor sailors were that were transformed into animals. But this is such a great episode, and it comes down through the centuries. This story becomes many, many folk tales. It becomes the story of Alcina in Torquato Tasso in the Jerusalem Liberata, and in the other one that I can't think of at the instant, um, major Renaissance Italian poem, I can't think of it. But George Friedrich Handel based his opera Alcina on this story, which in turn comes from the Odyssey. And there's also a fabulous Chinese story that I tell to children. It's called Mrs. Number Three. And Mrs. Number Three welcomes travelers into her home, and they all disappear. No one knows where the travelers go. And every month, Mrs. Number Three comes to the market, and she has a herd of donkeys that she sells, and she makes a good profit. But one traveler is a little suspicious of Mrs. Number Three because he can't sleep, and he goes and he looks in her bedroom at night. He sees a candle burning at night, and Mrs. Number Three has these tiny dolls. She has a farmer doll and an ox doll. And she puts them down on the dirt floor of her bedroom, and she puts water in her mouth. And then she sprays the dolls with this water, and they come to life. And the farmer doll plows Mrs. Number Three's bedroom floor. And then she gives the farmer doll seeds, and he plants the seeds, and wheat grows from Mrs. Number Three's floor. And she harvests the wheat, and then the dolls turn back into dolls, and then she goes to bed. And in the morning, what is she serving to all these men that have come to stay in her house? She's serving wheat cakes. And the hero of the story runs away, but he comes back and looks through the window. And indeed, once you eat one of Mrs. Number Three's wheat cakes, you turn to a donkey. So he comes back, and he's brought some wheat cakes of his own, and he swaps them with Mrs. Number Three's, and he forces her to eat her own wheat cakes, and she turns into a donkey. So that's that. All right, let's see where we are in our list of the feminine. Oh, okay. So Queen Arete and Nausicaa, my favorite name in the Odyssey, Nausicaa, which is how that is pronounced. Uh, when Odysseus washes ashore, he's got nothing. He has not even a mast, not even a piece of wood, not a scrap of clothing. He's completely naked, and he lands on the island where Queen Arete and King Alcinous rule. And he meets the daughter, Nausicaa. He's hiding under a pile of leaves, but Athena has decided that it should be laundry day, that Nausicaa should go and do laundry. Again, cloth, weaving, clothes, keeping them washed and clean and folded. This is Nausicaa's job, and all her servant girls or slave girls go with her, and they all go down to the river to wash these clothes. And that's where she meets Odysseus, and he emerges completely naked, covered in brine, like this wild creature, and begs her for help. All the servants are terrified and run away, but Nausicaa is one of the greatest portraits in all of Greek literature. She's only in this one book and a tiny little bit in the next book, but she's not afraid of him. She wants to know who he is. She says, why are the gods so angry at you? Look at yourself. You're in a terrible condition. The only people that get to be in this condition are people that the gods are angry at. What have you done to make the gods angry? I can give you a bath. I can wash you. I can give you some of my brother's clothes. I'm doing the family laundry, and go back and see my mother. Her father is the king, but she says to Odysseus, go into my father's palace, walk right past my father, go up to my mother, and clasp her knees. Throughout ancient Greek, certainly through the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you grab someone by the knees, this is a gesture of total supplication. You are absolutely putting yourself at their mercy. You are absolutely begging them. And it's very, very, very rare that anybody refuses someone if they're clasping their knees. One of the dramatic times this doesn't happen, when Achilles in the Iliad at the end, when Achilles has basically gone crazy with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this one Trojan throws himself at his knees and begs for life, and he kills him. A shocking, shocking thing. But Odysseus clasps the knees of the queen, and Nausicaa says, "If my mother wants to help you, then you're all set. My father will do what you need to get done to get home, but my mother is the one who has to decide." And indeed, Odysseus then goes into the palace and tells the whole story. It's one of the only times in the story when Odysseus actually tells the truth from beginning to end, but he unburdens his heart to Queen Arete. And there, I just think they're a fabulous pair, Queen Arete and Nausicaa. And as soon as Odysseus finishes the story, the king Alcinous, sorry, the king says, "Well, you seem like a nice guy. I wouldn't mind someone like you for my son-in-law. Will you marry my daughter?" And this shocks, when I talk about the Odyssey with high school students, this is the scene they always want to talk about, that Odysseus is offered in marriage to this princess, and he turns it down, and he wants to get home to Penelope. He wants to get home to his wife. So, and of course, the minutes are flying by as I yakety yak, but that's what I do. Okay. Oh, this is cool. Oh, I love this. Okay. So, so the wackiest thing, and this is another Circe connection. From this position of being completely lost and completely traumatized and finding Circe's cave, escaping from becoming animals, they then live with Circe for a year. All the men live with Circe for a year. It's this kind of restorative period. And then she says to him, "You're never going to get home until you go to Hades. You have to take your ship across the border of the ocean." The ocean at this time was conceived as a sort of a ring around the island that was Earth. And nobody really quite knew or thought about what was on the other side of this ocean river. And Circe says, "That's where you'll get to Hades. And I'm going to give you a black ram. And you have to take this ram down into the underworld. And all the dead are there. But now, okay, my high horse is out for repair, so I can't get on it right now. But this is my rant against Walt Disney's movie Hercules. The short version is everything in Walt Disney's Hercules is wrong. Every single thing. Watch the movie from beginning to end. Every single detail is wrong. Above all, Hades. There is no flame in the underworld. There is not a flicker, a spark. There is no fire in the Homeric underworld. It is dark. It is cold. It is, above all, boring. If you weren't already dead, you would be bored to death in the underworld. There's nothing to do. And the souls, unless you were a great, great hero or a great, great villain, the souls of all the dead, they've forgotten that they were ever alive. They've forgotten who they were. They don't remember being alive. So it's this very strange. The New York City Ballet did this great performance of Orpheus and Eurydice, and they did the opera, but it was the ballet dancers that performed the underworld, and they were like zombies. It was wild. They were also naked. It was crazy. But this whole stage of these naked zombies walking around being in the underworld. Anyway, Odysseus arrives here, and what he has to do is take the ram that Circe has given him, and he has to dig a trench. Apparently, the ground in the underworld is just like the ground here. He has to dig a trench in the underworld, and then he has to slaughter the ram and let its blood fall into this trench. And all the dead people come to drink the blood. This incredible image, and he has to chase them away. He can only the dead people that he wants to see, only the dead people he wants to talk to. He's there to talk to Tiresias, who was before he died, he was a seer. Tiresias also, since we're talking about women Tiresias is one of the only transsexual mythological creatures that I know of. He lived both as a woman and as a man when he was alive. But after he talks to Tiresias and learns the way home, all these other dead figures want to come up to drink the blood. And then he looks and he sees his mother. Odysseus looks up and he sees Anticlea, his own mother. He doesn't know that she was dead. I love this. He has no idea that she's died. He sees her in the underworld and she won't even approach. She's very timid. She won't approach. And he asks Tiresias, like, why won't my mother come and talk to me? And Tiresias says, invite her over to drink the blood. So this bizarre image of Odysseus watching his mother drink blood out of a trough on the ground. And then she wakes up. She knows who he is. And she tells him all the news from home. Penelope is still faithful. Telemachus is growing up and he's having trouble with the suitors that have invaded your house. And then Odysseus says, how did you die? Were you struck down by the plague from the god Apollo? Like, what caused you to die? And Anticlea looks right at him and she says, you did. I died for loss of you. Mourning your loss is what caused me to die. And then she wanders off into the darkness and the non-flame of Hades. Love that. Love that. Love that. So I see we are almost out of time. I knew this would happen. The time is going to fly. Oh, but so anyway, so the catalog of women then happens. Anticlea walks off, and then one after another, after another, after another, all these women come up to drink the blood. And all of the women have stories either as daughters or mothers or both. It's this really fascinating. This is in book 11 of the Odyssey. Just this fascinating passage. He meets Jocasta, the wife and mother of Oedipus, and he meets just this long list of women and who have, most of them have sort of experienced treachery or practiced treachery, but it's this long, and this is how he ends the story of his adventure when he finally, the last of the women come to drink the blood and leave him. Then we're back in the palace of Queen Arete, and Odysseus is telling his story, and he's about to be sent home, and that's exactly halfway through the book.